It is time for another naval history lesson with Master Team and Oliver. We're going to go back a little bit farther in time for this one. We've been kind of focusing on more recent naval history, and this one's going to go back to the War of 1812, but as you can kind of tell from the title, it's got a bit of a local touch to it. So we're going to set the stage and just remind ourselves what's going on in the world right now. So the War of 1812 started when, well, for a few years, Britain and America were kind of treating each other like a couple of exes who had a bad breakup. And at the same time, England was at war with France, because they almost always were, and America was a strong ally of France. So Britain kind of was getting in the way of trying to stop America from being a good ally. So what happened was in 1812, the U.S. declared war on England, but basically using Canada as the proxy. And then the Great Lakes, much like the Battle of Atlantic, the Great Lakes became a key battleground. And there were some really large ships on there that had large crews and were very, very capable ships. And General Isaac Brock, who died at Queenston Heights early in the war, said that keeping those lakes open, especially Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, were key to the whole operation. So in April of 1813, a little bit before, a few months before, in the spring of what we're talking of the season we're talking about, shipbuilders in York, which is now Toronto, they were putting together the finishing touches on what would have been the largest ship on their lakes at that time. And that would have shifted the advantage heavily to the British at that time. Well, the Americans didn't want that to happen, and they knew all about the Isaac Brock because they had spies. So their plan was to capture the Brock, take it back with them, and then have the balance of power shifted heavily in their favor. So the British, while they were a little bit outnumbered in the battle, they decided to retreat. They burned the Isaac Brock so that the Americans couldn't get her. And then the Americans, after doing some looting and pillaging in town for a bit, they just went home because their real objective was not capturing York. Their real objective was capturing the Isaac Brock. And this is a picture of what the Brock would have looked like, and I don't know how well you can see the people down there, but to kind of get an idea of the scale, she was a pretty big vessel. A few days before the events that we're talking about, in September 10th, was the Battle of Lake Erie, which is also, if you look at history books, sometimes called the Battle of Put-in Bay. And that was an American victory, and it was what that meant was the U.S. now controlled Lake Erie. So the balance of power heavily shifted not only on the lake, but in that whole area of what is now southern Ontario and the northern parts of the U.S. So the Americans were able to take back Detroit. They were able to then win the Battle of the Thames. They broke the Indian Coalition Federation that was headed by Tecumseh. So that now they had effectively all of that area around southern Ontario was kind of wide open for them. And then really what their master plan was to do the same thing at Lake Ontario and then send ships down the St. Lawrence, which they would now control, and send troops into Montreal. Now you have to understand, this is before Uber Eats, so when you were really jonesing a Montreal bagel, you had pretty limited options. It also would have meant that Lower Canada, which is what we now call Quebec, which was much, much, much more developed at that time, that would have come under American control as well. So that was probably part of it, their thinking also. So, September 28th, 1813, the Burlington Races, what we're talking about today. So the British and American fleets that are going to meet up, here's a bit of a rundown of them. And we're particularly going to be talking about the two commanders, Commodore James Yeo and Commodore Isaac Chauncey, and a little bit of their flagships. Not so much in the details of them, but we're going to be referring to the Pike and the Wolf. So keeping track of who's who on your scorecard. You'll notice that the Americans seem to have the advantage, and part of that is an advantage largely on paper because some of those 10 American ships were actually tied together. So the larger ships were towing smaller ships to increase their firepower, but that would then decrease their maneuverability. And there were a couple of other things, but certainly the General Pike was a formidable vessel, roughly twice as large as the General Wolfe. So the Americans make their approach, and of course they're tall ships. You can see them coming from quite far off, so all the observers on the Canadian side can see this happening, and they all know what's going on. So the fleet is spotted, and then the British come out to meet them, and they were kind of milling around in the water already, sort of waiting and being on station. They sail a little bit further out into the lake to give themselves a little bit more maneuvering room, and so on. And around mid-morning, the Wolfe makes the first move. And what she does is she turns back around and attempts to break through the American line in the middle and split them up, and that, divide and conquer kind of thing. So the Pike sees what's going on. She also turns to intercept, and Wolfe opens fire. Now initially, Wolfe has the advantage because the Pike is not turned all the way around, so the Wolfe has a full broadside onto not necessarily a weaker part, but certainly a less fewer guns part on the Pike. And the Pike suffers some damage, loses a mast, sails are torn up, and so on, but does manage to finish the turn, and once the Pike has a broadside on the Wolfe, returns fire. And at this point, Wolfe suffers effectively a disaster. One of the masts on the Wolfe crashes down and takes another mast with it, and brings down all kinds of rigging and other gear along with it. And at that point, the Wolfe is pretty much out of it. She can still use her guns, but she has very little maneuverability, very little forward speed at this point, or very limited forward speed. And with all the rigging crashed down and in the way, is in some serious trouble. So in this picture, it sort of shows what the scene would have looked like at the beginning. Again, more just to give you a sense of the two ships in comparison with each other in terms of rigging and so on. Not a great idea of the scale, though. This one, if you had the time to really stop and look at it and see the ship movements, the darker ones, the black ones are the Americans, the gray ones are the British. You can see where the British start out and where the Americans start out, and then how they maneuver to meet. And then right around when the time they make one of their last turns, kind of in the middle there, that's when the Wolfe, of course, is effectively disabled. And then the last little bit is let's call it the strategic retreat. Okay, at this point, as I mentioned, the battle is pretty much over for the Wolfe. There's other American ships, there's other British ships as well, but those two flagships that are really going to lead the pack, those are on the British side anyhow. That flagship is effectively finished. But the Royal George sneaks in between and lays down cover fire. So what the Royal George does is she takes on the Pike for a while, and that gives the flagship, the Wolfe, time to get themselves together, clear the decks, dump the bodies, take the wounded below, and get ready to get back into it. Not really get into it so much, but get ready to do something and to continue leading the rest of the fleet. HMS Melville and Earl of Moray also join in. They're a little bit further back, and that becomes important a little bit later. And so does HMS Melville. So if you're keeping track on your scorecard, keep that in mind. They also join in, trading heavy fire with the other American ships, not necessarily the Pike, but certainly with the American fleet. Commodore Yeo then turns west and makes best speed. It's pretty limited for him at this point, but makes best speed for Burlington Bay. The rest of the British fleet follow, and then the Americans give chase. And here's where what looked like was a heavy advantage to the Americans actually turns out to be not quite such a great thing, because now some of those vessels that were towing other vessels are much slower. So in the next hour, according to records, according to spectators and ship's logs, for the next hour and a half, you've got 16 ships racing across the Lake Ontario. And they started at about 25 kilometers off the shore, and they're coming back towards shore. You get spectators on both sides, harder to see obviously from the American side, but they can still see something. And you've got spectators lined up as best they can on the Canadian side. And this is of course where the name Burlington Races comes from. There's a story about a storm coming through, although that may or may not have been a huge factor in it. This picture, I really like the picture, but it gives you that couple of things about it that are kind of, well, we'll talk. So you can see the storm clouds, and they look really, really ominous. They might not have been that ominous. You can see the General Wolfe with lost sails and with tattered sails of those that are remaining coming. We'll assume that's west. See spectators on shore. Now it might not have been that close to shore. That's awfully close to shore, but we'll give the artist some license there. Okay, take a little side trip at this point because it could have gone differently. Commodore Chauncey, the American, could have captured a couple of vessels of the British, and including a couple of the ones that we've already mentioned. But of these 6 British ships that were out there, we've only named 4. So there were still 2 more that were farther back, and they could have been captured, which would have tipped the balance of power toward the Americans. Maybe not all the way, and maybe not heavily, but they would have tipped the balance. But Commodore Chauncey decided he was going all out, and it was going to be all or none, was what he had told the person who said, hey, why don't we just grab these guys and call it a day. Now because of that, everything changes, or that changes the entire story, I guess. So the British ships, they are a little bit faster. They're not towing anything. They're maybe a little bit smaller, a little bit sleeker, and they are able to keep ahead of the Americans. Pike is able to stay in range a little bit, but is still falling behind. Pike, don't forget, has lost a mast, has some damaged sails. Not only that, but one of the broadsides that got it hold her below the waterline, so she's leaking. So the sailors are pumping out the bilge as fast as they can. And also at one point, while firing one of the forward guns, it exploded, and that killed about 20 crew members. And that was probably the single most deadly incident on the Pike that day. So she's not in great shape either, but she's keeping it going. And then this shows a map of likely path that was followed. And they probably ended up somewhere off of Bronte, not all the way to Burlington Bay, not all the way into Hamilton Harbor, but into Bronte. And when they got there, they set up a defensive position. Now there's a couple of options here, or a couple of versions of the story. One is the one that has shown up in a lot of history books, and that I was combing through, and I found some of these. And that is that the Yeo and the British fleet, they took a chance. They used the storm surge that was giving them some advantage and a little bit more water and some local knowledge of where the sandbars were and what the best path through them was. And they got into Burlington Bay. I came across an article that was based on a more recent analysis of ship's logs and things like that, and best estimates of speed. And I'm going to go with that one for a couple of reasons. One, it looks like it was pretty well researched, pretty thoroughly researched. And two, the man who wrote it, his name is Robert Williamson, and I actually should say Commander Robert Williamson. And he was the commanding officer of Star, HMCS Star back in the day. So, and he's a local historian in Hamilton. So I'm going to go with his take on it. And he's the one who suggests they come to anchor in Burlington Bay, but not Burlington Bay, I'm sorry, in Bronte. But they put spring lines on their anchors. And I'll remind you what a spring line is in a moment. But they also then are within range of shore batteries. So they have protection from shore. They put themselves into a defensive position. They come to anchor, but then they have spring lines on the anchors. And I'll get to that in a moment. The Americans come in, see this heavy defensive position, and they just leave. They don't even bother trying to engage. So a spring line, when you tie a ship or a boat for that matter, from the bow, from the front to the jetty. You can also run another line that goes from that same point on the jetty to the back. So now you've got extra support on that point, and it prevents some of the forward and back motion. So that's what a spring line is. Now, a spring line on your anchor, what that would allow you to do is if you were to heave in on your spring lines, then you're effectively pulling your anchor lines close, and what that will do is won't move the anchor, it's going to move the boat, the ship. So what that would allow you to do is pivot the ship. And what that would give you as a defensive position is no matter which direction the Americans or your enemy ships are coming in, you can always heave in on one of those anchor lines and pivot the ship so that you've got a broadside facing your enemy. And if you have, depending on how long it takes your gun crews to reload, you could pivot the ship and present a fresh broadside and then pivot it back and do it again. So it's a very, very strong defensive position. And the British were all doing that. So they were all lined up in that highly defensive position. So that gave them the advantage. So yes, it was a retreat, but it was a tactical retreat. Okay, what happened in the days following? Well, shortly after that, so the British obviously had to make repairs. They did that. Within a couple of days, they're ready to return to the lake. But everything starts to kind of unravel after that a little bit, or at least it seems to. So Tecumseh is killed. That breaks up the Indian Confederation even more. Commodore Chauncey, he captures 5 British ships down on the eastern end of the lake, burns another one. So now the British have even fewer ships on the lake. The good news is sailing season kind of comes to a close at that point. So from here on out, what's happening is we're just waiting for spring, waiting for the ice to come out. And by the time the ice comes out, another ship that the British were building, the HMS St. Lawrence, she's launched. She is huge, over 100 guns, over 700 crew. She's the largest ship on the lakes by far. She had more weaponry, more power than the flagship of Lord Horatio Nelson at Trafalgar, which was only a few years before that, less than 10 years before, in 1805. So his flagship would have been like the pride of the British fleet out on the oceans. HMS St. Lawrence is bigger than that. It cost $500,000 at that time, which would be somewhere in the neighborhood of utterly insane by today's dollars. Or maybe somewhere around like a cost of an aircraft carrier. I don't really know. She would have been huge and vastly expensive. And as powerful as she was, and maybe that was kind of a good thing, never fired a shot, never got into battle. She would just sort of sail up to the Americans and just sit there and effectively dare them to come out, and they never did. So the Americans never got a chance to get a stronger foothold on Lake Ontario, partly because of the HMS St. Lawrence. And then, so then we're into 1814, and that's a picture of the St. Lawrence, or an artist's rendition or something, but absolutely massive ship. There's some legacy though. There's some local history, which is one of the reasons why I picked this. And that was one of the ships that we talked about. So there was the General Wolfe, there was the other one, and which I forgot the name of. It'll come to me, and then I'll just blurt it out. And then there's the Lord Melville. And the Lord Melville was the 3rd ship in the line. She started out as a schooner, was large to a brig during construction, and several of the engagements in Lake Ontario she was involved in. Almost got captured by the Pike on that day, but didn't. And then a little while later, over the winter, while the St. Lawrence is being built, while the sailing season is done, while we're waiting for spring, so a little while after the Burlington Races, she was renamed HMS Star. At a certain point, she was converted mostly to a troop carrier, wasn't really battle-worthy anymore, but took part in a successful attack on Fort Oswego. Prince George, told you I'd blurt it out. Took part in an attack on Fort Oswego, and a little while after that was broken up and scrapped. So that is the end of this session. I'd love to be there to have some conversation about it, but we'll leave it at that, and we'll talk to you another time.